Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thank you for joining me. We have been gone for a couple weeks. I had spring break, a trip to South Dakota, Mount Rushmore, Devil's Tower, Deadwood, Sturgis with my daughter, and then a couple of work things. Happy to be back. Hopefully this is the last break for a little while. Few things happened in my absence that I want to mention, and then we're going to talk about two things today. One, we're going to talk about the sentencing of El Menchito, which also happened while I was away, but I think is worth talking about. And then I want to present a few different analyses of this interplay between tariffs on Mexico from the United States and how that affects the war on drugs, the fight against the cartels, and how President Scheinbaum's personality plays into that, especially vis-a-vis President Trump. So that's where we're going to go. As I say, there's a couple of things that have happened that I think are worth noting. Number one is the Camarena family filed a federal lawsuit against the Sinaloa cartel and its predecessors, as well as Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. The lawsuit is in part founded on, or became possible based on the designation of the Sinaloa cartel as a terrorist organization. Remember, we talked about that designation when it happened a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to get into the specifics of the case at the moment because we're going to do that in an episode coming up either next week or the following week. It is my hope that we can get one of the lawyers who filed the case on behalf of the Camarena family to come on and talk about that lawsuit. I've got some questions that I'd love to get answered, and just some thoughts about it. But like I say, we're going to hold off on that. But it's important and it's significant, and it's great for the Camarena family to have an effort to get some type of justice for what happened to Agent Camarena. Other thing that came up a week or so ago was that Caro Quintero appeared in court. The big issue that came up in this initial appearance was whether or not the government was going to seek the death penalty. And they were given until May to make a decision on that. Otherwise, these appearances are, especially early on, relatively pro forma and relatively insignificant. I will note that one of the things that was compelling about Caro Quintero's appearance was the fact that there were a number of DE agents outside the courthouse where Caro appeared, there in support of Agent Camarena, and it was quite a show, and I mean that in a good way, not in a negative way. The last thing I wanted to mention that I think has gotten very little mainstream attention that should have was there was a methamphetamine lab that was discovered in Zacatecas over the last few days. And the size and scope of this clandestine laboratory is really staggering. It is said that the area of the laboratory comprised about 395,000 square meters. It took place in the town of Carrizalillo, an area of low population, strategically used by criminal groups to manufacture drugs, in particular synthetic drugs. Listen to some of this. Among the confiscated materials, this comes from a ABC Noticias Mexico. But it says, among the confiscated materials were found 36 reactors, 56 drums, 65 vats, 9 mixers, 77 gas tanks, 209 different drums, 4 motor generators, 62 condensers, and 94 burners, in addition to other items used in the synthesis and crystallization of methamphetamine. This laboratory site was divided into different areas, including precursor storage, chemical processing, and crystallization. In the area of the criminal precursors, authorities seized approximately 63,100 liters of various substances, including benzyl chloride, as well as 125 kilograms of caustic soda. Listen to this. According to the Navy, the destruction of these chemicals prevented the production of 27,930 kilograms of methamphetamine, which would be the equivalent to more than 698 million doses. Get that, 698 million doses on the market. One of the things that's interesting is immediately upon notice of this, and when Sedena was sending out, was sending out notices of the capture, they attributed the lab's ownership to Los Chapitos. Unofficially, there's been some question about whether or not that's the case, whether or not it actually was Los Chapitos, and I'll refrain from giving any commentary on that until we get more. But suffice it to say, if you hear the lab was Los Chapitos, just take that with a grain of salt for the moment. One of the things that people have been talking about recently is this idea that as soon as something happens, there has to be an immediate attribution, right? It's got to be somebody. You know, if there's an attack on one group, we've got to find out who the other group was. And some people have suggested that both the government and some journalists in Mexico are predisposed to identifying the groups allegedly involved maybe too quickly and without enough information. I'm not going to say that these people don't know what they're doing and things, but there is a question of, should we get more facts, a little bit more time go by before we're saying who's involved? Anyways, question whether or not Los Chapitos really were the quote-unquote owners of this laboratory in Zacatecas. All right, let's talk about El Menchito. We talked about his trial a few months ago, and I just want to go through kind of what happened at the sentencing and what it means. As you'll remember, Ruben Alzaguera, El Menchito, is the son of El Mencho, right? The government said that El Menchito was essentially CJNG's second in command for at least 7 years before El Menchito was extradited to the United States in February of 2020. When he was sentenced in Washington, D.C. by U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell, he had faced a maximum sentence of life imprisonment and a mandatory minimum of 4. He was going to get someplace between 40 years and life. One of his defense attorneys had asked for the 40-year prison sentence, And he said a couple of different things. Number one, remember, El Menchito is only 35. And his attorney said, look, he was 14 when he was recruited into his father and his family's drug trafficking operations. His attorney, Anthony Colombo, said that he grew up in an unstable environment wrought with violence and corruption. He said Mr. Oseguera is as much as anyone both a product and a victim of that environment. The judge didn't buy it and said, you weren't a child when you were committing all these crimes, and you won't be sentenced as a child here. Remember some of the things he's accused of doing. He was accused of ordering the killings of at least 100 people. He personally killed at least 6 people, it was said. And maybe most significantly, if you'll remember, he ordered the shooting down of a Mexican military helicopter, which resulted in the death of at least 9 people in May of 2015. It's also said that in 2015, he killed 5 bound men who owed him money by slashing their throats with a knife. It's also said that he shot and killed one of his drivers when the man did not repark a vehicle quickly enough. So in the trial, it said that jurors had heard testimony that he was personally responsible. Menchito was personally responsible for trafficking cocaine and methamphetamine in total amounts worth over $12 billion. And one of the things that we had talked about before is, remember, he basically agreed to a plea bargain. And you can see why a plea bargain makes sense, right? You're 35 years old, and you're going to be, you're facing someplace between 40 years and life in prison. So at best, you're going to get out when you're 75. So if you ever want to see the light of day again and not be in prison, plea bargaining makes sense. And apparently, he had agreed to a plea bargain. And the prosecution thought they had a plea agreement right up until the moment when he turned it down, refused to sign it, and elected to go to trial instead. And of course, he lost at trial, right? They're all going to lose at trial. We've talked about that. Those are hard cases to try to win. And most of the time, what you're trying to do is get the best deal you possibly can. And you can see, his counsel made the arguments that they needed to make. But my point is, for some reason, El Menchito decided not to go through with the plea agreement. As a result, he's now sentenced to life in prison. And I apologize to y'all. I was going to look and see where he is at the moment, if I could find that on Inmate Tracker, but forgot to do that. So I'll try to remember to do that next time. Okay, second topic for today, or third, depending on how you're counting. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the threats of tariffs on Mexico from the United States and how, if at all, that's impacted the fight against the cartels, particularly from the Mexican side. And I gave you some of my opinions an episode or 2 ago, and I've been very clear that I think the narrative that I see a lot, that Mexico is backing down in the face of tariffs and much of what is being done to combat the cartels is done in response to the tariffs. I've said that I'm not 100% convinced that that narrative is correct. In fact, I have deep-seated feelings that it's not correct, or that that's too simplistic. Let's put it that way. I think that's much better. But rather than giving you my opinion, I wanted to present what some others have said. Experts in this field, what their thoughts are. And I'll try to do it succinctly, but there's some of this that I think is very interesting. Some of these papers are far longer than I'm going to give them justice for here. As I've said before, I read everything so you didn't have to. So let's talk about some of this, the fight against cartels and tariffs. World Politics Review has an analysis. And one of the things that I think this part here is very, very interesting and very important. According to a study by the think tank Mexico Evalua, during President Scheinbaum's first 100 days in office, the number of operations against criminal groups increased more than sixfold compared to the same period of AMLO's term, while direct confrontations between criminal groups and the authorities almost doubled. Arrests and seizures of drugs and weapons increased by even larger margins. Again, I'm going to reiterate my personal belief that a portion of these changes, the increased operations against the cartels, is by design. It's part of President Scheinbaum's policy. It was something that she was planning on doing and would have been doing with or without the threat of tariffs by the Trump administration. Now, is that all of it? Is that part of it? You can make your own determination on that. So World Politics Review goes on and says, President Scheinbaum has consistently said that strengthening intelligence and investigative capacities will remain one of the primary pillars of her security strategy. Although building these institutional capabilities will take time, the statistics show that she and Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch are at least changing the paradigm they inherited from their predecessors. A companion story in World Politics Review from Eduardo Arcos focuses more on the tariff threats and the demands of the Trump administration. And what Mr. Arcos does is he looks at some of the short, medium-term, and long-term consequences of these dynamics. So he says, in the short term, the most obvious consequence of Trump's demands will likely be an increase in confrontations between authorities and criminals in the northern states, especially those with large urban areas that are major drug trafficking hubs, like Baja California, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas. These states, home to some of the country's most violent cities, such as Tijuana and Reynosa, are likely to experience an uptick in violence related to organized crime. He goes on to say, although the National Guard's deployment is concentrated in the north, operations are also likely to increase gradually in central and southern states, including Jalisco, Michoacan, and I never pronounced this right, Guanajuato, where a large proportion of clandestine laboratories for the production of methamphetamines and fentanyl are located. Scheinbaum is likely to prioritize the dismantling of clandestine laboratories to show her commitment to reducing drug production, a more effective strategy than combating trafficking once the drugs have been produced. Her administration is also expected to focus on seizing chemical precursors used in meth and fentanyl production, which will require increasing surveillance and interdictions along trafficking routes, especially those connecting large port cities like Manzanillo to drug-producing regions inland. I will note, so if you go back, he projects that there will be more operations by the National Guard in states like Jalisco and Michoacan. I'll note that over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of discussion of at least 1,000 or more new National Guard troops moving into Jalisco. So whether that's evidence of this coming true or not, that was part of what he was predicting. In the medium term, he says these enforcement efforts will lead to a reconfiguration of the country's main criminal organizations, their alliances, and their activities. I pause because that's the medium term, but that's a big deal, right? I mean, a reconfiguration of the country's main criminal organizations, their alliances, and their activities. He goes on to say, as is often the case in Mexico's drug war, losses inflicted on one group generally lead to relative or absolute gains by another. Criminal groups that have traditionally engaged in synthetic drug production and trafficking, like the Sinaloa cartel or like CJNG, are likely to be the government's prime targets. We've talked about that over the last few weeks, right? Doesn't it seem like the CDS is getting hit with somebody big being arrested, if not weekly, or if not daily, almost weekly? As a result of the fact that CDS and CJNG are likely to be the main governmental targets, rival groups or splinter factions of these organizations will seek to fill the void left by the weakening of these major cartels. Even, and this is a little bit concerning, even if Scheinbaum's administration is successful at curbing drug trafficking to the United States, absolute volumes of smuggled drugs will remain staggeringly high, and cartels will continue to fight for their shares of the billions of dollars generated by drug sales annually. So, medium term, strategic realignments maybe of some of the primary cartels, and maybe new groups emerging. If you look at my newsletter, and by the way, I've said this a bunch, the newsletter is pretty cool. I put it together every week, so I'm biased. All you have to do is send me your email. A couple people did it last week. I've gotten a couple of emails with just email addresses on them. Make sure you say something about the newsletter. Otherwise, I think that it might be a spam or a hoax or something. But one of the things that has been pointed out in the newsletter recently is the emergence of quote unquote new cartels or new factions arising in different places. And we're going to talk about this next week. But this appears to be some evidence of what Mr. Arcos was talking about, what he was predicting, this realignment of the cartel structures and the emergence of new groups or splinter factions. He then concludes by saying, in the longer term, preventing cartels from diversifying their criminal activities and stopping the emergence of new and more violent groups, that's a scary thought, will be Scheinbaum's main security challenges. Combating one kind of criminal activity, such as drug production and drug trafficking, often provokes changes in the behavior of criminal groups as they seek to engage in other crimes that can be just as socially and economically disruptive. For example, over the past decade, Mexican criminal groups have diversified their activities, including oil pipeline theft, creation of a black market for fuel, which has generated major security crises in the states of central Mexico and has had severe economic implications for Mexico's state-owned oil company Pemex, which is in a disastrous state right now. Extortion has also increased notably over the past decade, even replacing drug trafficking as the primary revenue source for some criminal organizations, such as Los Viagras in Michoacan. Over the past 2 decades, Mexico has experienced cycles of fragmentation in its criminal landscape following the implementation of hardline security strategies. Obviously, this has been off and on through history and with different presidents and different administrations. But what he says is this fragmentation has created immense challenges as authorities are forced to combat criminal groups on different fronts, while new, smaller groups tend to be more violent than large, centralized criminal enterprises. This situation is currently evidenced by the ongoing fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel, leading to a spike in violence in northwest Mexico as splinter factions combat former partners and the authorities to assert territorial control. In addition to these potential ramifications, the U.S. designation of 6 major Mexican drug trafficking groups as terrorist organizations will become one of the most contentious issues in Mexico and U.S. relations. As long as it is in place, Mexico will be wary of security cooperation with its northern neighbor, given the deep-rooted concerns over sovereignty and increased U.S. interventionism. Moreover, the designation could have huge economic repercussions, as these groups' business and financial dealings extend into numerous sectors with thousands of legitimate business and individuals, including in the United States, potentially connected with them and therefore susceptible to sanctions. Lastly, he says, the National Guard's mobilization and focus on the northern border will also lead to law enforcement vacuums in other regions of Mexico that require greater presence of the authorities, such as the south and central states like Chiapas, Puebla, Guerrero, and Morelos. In all these states, major criminal groups engage in a wide range of activities, including cargo and fuel theft, kidnapping, and extortion, amongst other crimes. Increasing the size of the National Guard, while necessary, is likely to be a gradual and slow process, leaving it overstretched to address the country's myriad challenges in the meantime. And I think this is a very, very cogent point. Mexico is very, very big. I think those of us in the United States in particular sometimes underestimate just how big it is. The U.S. put fentanyl number 1, right? Public enemy number 1 for good reason. So most of the effort, let me rephrase that. That might be overstrong. So a good deal of the effort, both in Mexico and the United States, is focused on disrupting the production and then transportation of fentanyl from Mexico to the United States, including efforts to combat the precursor chemicals that come from China. as is often the case, if you focus on one thing, other things start to happen, right? You end up with a situation where all of a sudden there's new production of methamphetamine in different places. There's the other criminal activity. And at some point, you can't, as a government, as a police force, as a National Guard, be in all places with equal strength at all times. So if you're a cartel, if you're a diverse cartel, or you're a new group, are you going to put all your money in fentanyl? Are you going to risk all of your resources into the fentanyl production and transportation? Or are you going to diversify? Are you going to move someplace else? If you're a new player, do you now see an entree in to different avenues? I received some information last week that I'm not sure if I can share. I'll find out tomorrow if I can share it, so I'll share it next week if I can. That talks about two things that are really significant. One is cocaine transportation from Mexico into the United States apparently is increasing dramatically over the last few months, as is the production of methamphetamine. And then you're also seeing that there is a weakening in the potency of some fentanyl coming into the United States from Mexico, in part because Mexican cartels are trying to avoid having to use some of the precursor chemicals from China. So they're substituting other precursors in order to end up at the same result, but there are drawbacks to those precursors. So there is clear evidence of some morphing of the activities of the cartels based on this focus on fentanyl at the moment. Okay. Two more articles that I wanted to talk about. One is from the Washington Post, and this talks more about President Scheinbaum, and I've already given you my thoughts on her and her efforts to move away from some of the policies of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, her mentor, at least in politics. So here's what the Washington Post had to say. First, as she has navigated Mexico's most important bilateral relationship, analysts say, Scheinbaum has shaken off the image that she is merely a dutiful protege of former President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the founder of their leftist Moreno party. Scheinbaum still faces enormous challenges. Trump may call her a very wonderful woman, but his administration hasn't ruled out U.S. military strikes on fentanyl targets in Mexico. He could cripple Mexico's export-reliant economy with recurrent tariff threats and pressure on auto manufacturers to relocate to the United States. The uncertainty and the volatility are going to remain, said Julian Ventura, a former senior ministry official. But Scheinbaum is among a handful of leaders who have built constructive dialogue with Trump. Mr. Ventura said that is a win. Scheinbaum's diplomatic skill, the Washington Post says, has surprised Mexicans who viewed her mainly as Lopez Obrador's handpicked successor. Of course, she had her own political credentials, right? She served as Mexico City's mayor. She won last year's presidential election by 33 percentage points. You know, President Trump talks about a mandate. 33 percentage points is a mandate. She's also been criticized as a brainy technocrat who moved in lockstep with AMLO, even imitating his country boy drawl. The Mexican Constitution prohibits presidents from seeking re-election. Nevertheless, AMLO still wields enormous influence in the Morena party. Some analysts have questioned whether Scheinbaum could replicate López Obrador's friendly relationship with Trump. The two men apparently bonded as charismatic figures or charismatic founders of anti-establishment movements. Scheinbaum, in contrast, is a low-key scientist with a PhD in energy engineering. She can be so unemotional that her main rival in the presidential race dubbed her the Ice Lady. But she brings her own strength to the job. The Post says she prepares rigorously for calls with Trump, consulting cabinet ministers, business leaders, and others, and studying the U.S. president's statements. She doesn't take umbrage at his insults, they say, and instead calmly lays out the facts. For example, after Trump said he would go ahead with the 25% tariffs on March 4, alleging a lack of progress by Mexico and Canada on stopping cross-border fentanyl shipments, Scheinbaum sent him a graphic with the data from the Department of Homeland Security showing that U.S. seizures at the border plummeted since October. Less fentanyl was reaching the United States because it was being stopped in Mexico, she told Trump. He didn't know about this graphic until after we sent it to him, she told reporters. Of course, there was Scheinbaum's expulsion of 29 drug traffickers. Political analyst Carlos Heredia said with this action, she essentially slammed her fist on the table and said, "I am in command." Okay. And then the last one I want to talk about real quickly is from the Brookings Institute. And we've talked a lot in the past about things written by Venda Felbab Brown. Puts out wonderful papers. Don't always have to agree with everything she says, but tremendous respect for her and her analyses. So she says, effectively managing the international supply of drugs is also important. Yet the proposed tariffs on China, both general and fentanyl specific, are likely to set significantly back or again lead to the suspension of China's counter narcotics. So she's saying, with respect to the precursors in China and the threats of tariffs, that any progress made in China's counter narcotics programs may be cut back. She goes on to say, maintaining the adroit diplomacy the Biden administration exhibited during 2023 and 2024 vis-a-vis China and fentanyl, and using it as a basis for deepening cooperation and addressing outstanding issues in the bilateral relationship would be a more fruitful approach. In the case of Mexico, the threat of a 25% fentanyl-linked tariff could actually stimulate meaningful cooperation against Mexican cartels and organized crime, something that was woefully lacking during the López Obrador administration. They go on to say, or she goes on to say, the Scheinbaum administration is more interested in combating organized crime. But any gains from the tariff threat will only be realized if the United States pursues the right objectives, doesn't subordinate anti-crime measures to migration control, and doesn't explode the relationship by resorting to unilateral military actions in Mexico. Let's just walk through those again. I just want to make sure everybody realized or caught that. Any gains from the tariff threat. So remember I said how much of Scheinbaum's different policies are attributable to the tariff threat can be debated. But to the extent there are gains that are directly related to the terror threat, they'll only be realized if the United States pursues the right objectives, doesn't subordinate anti-crime measures to migration control, and doesn't resort to unilateral military actions, which, she says, could, quote, explode the relationship, close quote. And we've talked here about, what would happen if there was unilateral military action and the things that could cause. And I'm sure we'll address that again as we go along and follow different things said by the various administrations. All right, that's what I had for today. Two things before we go. Number one is my book, Someone Had to Lie, is available. It's available on Amazon. It's also available with a signed copy at llewellynwriting.com. The book talks an awful lot about the fentanyl crisis and the kind of the responsible parties. And among those parties that have helped shape this fentanyl crisis in the United States are the Mexican cartels, U.S. gangs, and, I assert in the book, with a fictional narrative, but the CIA. And if you want to see how those three things all come together, get a copy of the book. If you do get a copy and you like it at all, please let me know. I'd really appreciate that. What are we going to talk about coming up? The next 3 or so episodes are going to touch on these three topics. One is I really want to look at the CDS Civil War, right? We're now several months into this, and there's a lot of reason to suggest that headwinds are blowing in one particular direction. And it calls into question the initial strategies that kind of led to this civil war. So we're going to talk about that. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the civil case brought by the Camarena family against Caro Quintero. And then I want to look very specifically at the charges that are being maintained against Caro Quintero, what they are, and more importantly, what they're not at this point. We're also going to keep an eye on some of the other, cases going on, El Mayo and some of the others that had come to the United States as part of that expulsion of the 29 traffickers. So that's what's coming up. I will prepare you. I'm also going to have a rant against a former DEA agent that we all know and love. But I just saw a video that I want to respond to, but I didn't want to respond to it less than 24 hours after seeing it because I wanted a little bit of time to digest it and not get too carried away with my rant. But that will be coming, so keep that in mind. All right. Thank you, everybody. Love doing these podcasts. I hope you enjoy them. Thanks for being with me, and I will talk to you next week on cartels, conspiracies, and Camarena. Take care, everybody.